Welcome to this episode of Let's Talk About EX, where we dive deep into the heart of workplace culture and employee experience. Now, I'm your host, Ryan McGrory, and today I'm thrilled to have Dr. Kathryn Page with us. Now, Kat is a Master of Leadership, Workplace Wellbeing and Organisational Development with a rich background in psychology and research. She's passionate about improving mental health in the workplace, fostering positive leadership practices and enhancing employee engagement and resilience. The Kat's not only a consultant, but also a leadership partner at ByMany, a company dedicated to creating leadership for a better world, where she continues to influence positive change across various sectors. Today, we'll explore the challenges leaders face in creating cultures that balance performance and well-being, and we're going to discuss whether the business world truly has enough genuine leaders who prioritise the well-being of their people. Kat, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us to share your invaluable insights.
Oh, thanks for having me. And I think we do need to hear the story of the headphones, though.
Okay, yes. Yeah.
Surely. I just feel that you need to explain.
It's the elephant in the room, isn't it?
It's the elephant in the room.
Yeah, I should refer to it. These are my headphones. They don't fit around my head, and it is because part one, I've got a big head. Part two, these are my daughter's headphones. She broke mine. She broke in, first off, breaking an entry, broke into the office space and broke my headphones. And then I've had to borrow hers as punishment. She's 2 years old, so she probably doesn't know about it. But yeah, that's why I'm wearing these, or sporting these beautiful pinky purpley headphones.
I think you're owning it. I actually think this could be the start of something.
Yes, yeah, some wild, crazy craze, of course. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, thanks for coming on. And yeah, talking about headphones and headwear and all sorts already. But I wanted to talk about your leadership philosophy. And your work emphasizes human-centered systems that enhance workplace experiences. And I wondered if you can share how this philosophy guides your approach to leadership and organizational design.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. It's a good question. And funnily enough, I work in the space of leadership, and I quite often ask leaders about their philosophy and their purpose. And I realized last week that I had an idea of my philosophy or my purpose, but I hadn't actually really succinct purpose statement, which I actually think is an important thing for every leader to do. But what I landed on was that my purpose, which I suppose is also my philosophy, is around creating a better world through work. And I think leaders are so critical to that. And where that really stems from is thinking of employees as humans, and actually thinking of leaders as humans versus as well, and designing systems and work experiences in and the workplace around what makes people most human. So what they need, what they're motivated by, and making decisions around that. There's so many different ways that we can be more human-centered in our work, but I think it all starts with empathy for the humans that we work with.
Awesome. Great answer. Treat people like people. Treat humans as humans.
It's a crazy idea.
Yeah, novel.
But it is interesting though that it is novel, because I think it probably wasn't until COVID where I think we really started to appreciate that the people that we work with are humans. We were able to take off those masks, and actually, permission to be human is one of my favorite things to say to people, including myself.
That's a good way to start.
It's okay to be human.
I suppose it's a good way to start if you're looking for your purpose, is just to take a step back and actually question some things. And a good lens to look through that is, I'm human. Oh, love it. Awesome. In your view, speaking of that, what are the challenges that you think leaders or humans face when they're trying to balance performance with the well-being of their teams? Because that's often, a challenge, and particularly one that's been quite clear during COVID and thereafter. I wonder how do you think leaders can effectively manage these often competing priorities?
Yeah, it's interesting, the context for that question, because when I first thought about that as an idea, I think the idea of performance and well-being is not necessarily in conflict. There is a whole host of research suggesting that when people are happy and well and thriving, and growing and feeling a sense of purpose, which is my definition of well-being. That sense of connection and growth, not just about being happy and content all the time. That actually does drive performance, and vice versa. Achievement and a sense of competence is so fundamental to well-being when we define it that way. And working and achieving and getting things done and performing, if you like, is so important for that. But I suppose in some ways that's an academic answer. If I was to step back from that and actually think about the realities of the working world, including having been a leader myself, it actually is quite challenging. And I think leaders these days are very much caught between often attention between organisational performance and the reality of needing to meet goals and hit KPIs, often in the context of doing more with less and trying to be more human and respond to the needs of their peoples. And I think there are competing priorities in regards to that. I myself have worked, in consulting and big corporate roles, and even as someone who deeply, deeply values well-being and being so committed to mental health and well-being, I quite often would find myself in a position where, you're delivering, a big global corporate client. You all thought you were working towards a particular timeline, and then something would change. And you would have to really be caught in a position where you feel that you need to put your team potentially under pressure to deliver an outcome, which potentially could come at a cost in terms of burnout, stress, etc. So even for the most well-intended people, that happens. I also think we're operating and leaders are operating within a very cost-constrained, resource-constrained environment. I think healthcare is a really obvious example of that, where in that context, performance is about safety or looking after the patients. And so quite often team leaders or leaders would be in a position where they'd need to balance the tension between what's right for the organisation or a patient, having people working overtime or double shifts because the other choice would be that person wouldn't get care. So I think there is a real trade-off. I also think there are personal biases and beliefs at play. So a lot of leaders who've come up through a different world and a different system, they may have different beliefs around what drives well-being and what that right balance is. Yep. I think there are still a lot of organisations that have been brought up and the culture would suggest that performance is more important than well-being. Delivering, particularly in client-oriented service organisations, like your big blue chip organisations that might have leaders that perceive there as being, a long line of talent who's just ready and waiting to take the place of someone who can't hack it, who can't sort of cope. So I think, there are real cultural things, but I also think, leaders are time poor these days and they're not immune to stress and burnout themselves. The 2024 State of the Workplace report by Gallup indicates that I think it was 1 in 4 or 25% of leaders indicated that they felt burnt out often or always. And I think around about 66% said often. So, burnout of leaders is a reality. Yep. And when you're time poor, when you're stressed yourselves, it's so hard to actually be thinking about impact on others when you're actually just trying to keep your own head above water. So, they're often, I think, the meat and the sandwich. And it's a tough job being a leader today. So it is, challenging. And then also adapting to individual needs. We've got these new generations in the workforce all wanting and expecting different things from a leader and from their organisation. And I do think fundamentally most leaders want to do the right thing. I don't think any leader, hopefully, turns up to work saying, you know what, I'm going to be a complete a-hole today. I think that they probably come in going, I want to do the best job that I can, but I've got this, I've got that. I'm dealing with this, I'm dealing with stuff at home. They are dealing with so much today.
Do you think largely there's still the view that there's well-being and performance, or well-being and even leadership as a dichotomy? That, there's either one or the other, and that they aren't two in the same. And I wonder if it's been traditionally how well-being has been labelled or viewed, particularly in corporates, as this separate thing or this other thing that HR look after, or it's a program, or it's a system, or whatever it is. What do you think about that? I
definitely don't think that they're binary constructs or in conflict with each other. I think it kind of depends on how you define well-being.
Yeah.
It's not about people sitting around and just feeling happy and content and not really having much on and just enjoying life. I do actually think well-being is in the pursuit of goals, and people actually like to be busy, they like to grow, they like to get things done. And so if you create an environment where people are able to motivate themselves and they are able to fulfill their needs, that they naturally will perform. Now, of course, every leader and people listening might be able to think of one or two people who don't fit that idea, and of course that is always going to be true. But I think for the most part, one does lead to the other, and that they are highly connected. So yeah, I don't necessarily think they need to be in conflict. I think they're very complementary, and I think it is a real imperative for leaders today to actually lead for well-being, not just lead for performance. And actually, it's about sustaining performance. I think that's the key word here. You can, in the short term, if people are highly stressed and overworked and really engaged, often in the short term, that can lead to outstanding sort of peak performance. But is it sustainable? I would argue not necessarily. And so what comes up must come down. And there is such a thing as over-engagement, and obviously burnout is an example of that, where people they don't have access to the resources that would enable them to sustain that peak performance. So I think, sustainable performance and sustainable engagement is, I think, where we should be aiming.
And I think with your last two answers, you've helped given a more well-rounded description or definition of well-being. I think in the past, particularly in a corporate or a workplace context, well-being has been thought of as a program. Or now I see it changing into well-being as just really is or isn't there burnout here.
Yes.
So I really like how you're given a more well-rounded view of well-being, and it kind of leads into the next question, because I know you've developed numerous influential models and systems to impact workplace well-being and also workplace mental health. I wondered, how do you see the role of leadership in terms of fostering a culture that prioritizes mental health and well-being?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, it's funny because when I did start out in this space, I was thinking about well-being as a very individual phenomenon and an idea, and that actually you could teach people to be happier at work. And it wasn't. So I started working in this space in 2005. So we weren't really talking about well-being. I definitely have seen, as your question suggests, quite a lot of progress over time around the system. And now we look at one of the models you referred to, worst name ever and very lengthy, not really pithy, but the integrated approach to workplace mental health really has three levers: prevent harm, and I'll go into the leader's role in this as well. So prevent harm, which is around addressing the work-based causes of stress and burnout. So, you would often call that the psychosocial sort of environment. Promote the positive, which is more around how you can recognise, promote employee strengths and things that you could do to promote the well-being of your teams, independent of harm, and then respond to people who have a mental health problem, regardless of cause. So people naturally, have things going on outside of work that we bring that side of us to work. So how does the organisation respond to that? So I think leaders fundamentally are how we interpret our work environment. We know from research that a lot of constructs like, feeling included, feeling engaged, usually around about 70% of that is driven by your relationship with your manager.
Yeah.
So how a manager shows up every single day impacts how a person experiences the work world. So I think there are multiple things that leaders can do that can really help to support that culture. One is through role modeling. So people will, when you're a leader, people watch you. And the shadow that you cast as a leader is far beyond even just your individual team, particularly if you're really senior. So the degree to which you talk about things like I've loved having leaders in the past who actually talk about when they're stressed. Which I think historically that was not okay for leaders to do that, because it was a sign of maybe, not coping or not being very effective, and perhaps people would then judge a leader for that. But now that creating that environment of vulnerability then opens up discussions around things like workload and prioritizing and those things, and prioritizing self-care. So I love also seeing leaders, say, look, we've had a really busy period of time. I've been feeling quite stretched myself. I'm feeling, I miss my family. I'm going to take Friday off, or I'm going to go play some golf, or I'm taking my daughter out to see the movies. That role modeling then just gives you that permission, and being able to sort of to switch off, I think, is important. But also, championing wellbeing initiatives. So quite often, as you said before, you alluded that was a HR thing. When you see leaders actually driving wellbeing initiatives, I think that speaks volumes. But also as leaders, we really are cultural architects, if you like. The leaders are the system, and creating a really safe environment where people can talk about their experiences through role modeling, but also just putting in place management behaviors or team meetings where you actually genuinely would say to people, how are you as a human? Like, let's actually talk about the human stuff. What I often see is when leaders are feeling stressed or stretched, the first thing that goes is the one-on-ones. And I would argue, and the research would suggest, that that's actually the very worst thing that you could do as a leader. It should actually be the highest priority in your calendar in some ways, because even just spending 15 minutes a week with a member of your team has such a huge impact on how people experience their work. And I would say there are really three things that you should talk about in that meeting. One is, as I said, how are you as a human? Like, what's happening? How's the family? How's life? How's your head? I tend to ask people about their mental health, but that's just me. That's not for everyone. And then, how's your work? I often will ask people how their workload is. So because we know that people are less comfortable talking about feeling stress, if you talk about workload, that's a very objective sort of easy thing to talk about, where someone might be overstressed or understretched, and you can sort of deal with that. And then the third question is, how can I help? I think that's one of the most powerful things that a leader can do, is to say, how can I help? Like, I'm here to serve you.
100%. Yeah,
just to name a few things.
Just to name a few things. Yeah. Hopefully, those listening, you've got your pens ready. If not, you can press the rewind button, or you can look at the transcript. But there's been a lot of gold shared already, and I agree with you as well. One of the worst things I think leaders could do is cancel their one-on-ones. I mean, I think what you cancel, or what you do and what you don't do, is a symbol of what's important usually. And I think it's the other message that you're sending when you cancel something, when you stop doing something. It's a message you send about what's prioritized or what's important, and also what can be let go of too. And you mentioned something there that I typed down. I love this reference to cultural architects, leaders being potentially in this position where they are the cultural architects. Based on your extensive experience, do you believe there are in our kind of current workplaces, do you think we have enough of these genuine leaders, these genuine kind of cultural architects who prioritize well-being, or do you think there's a deficiency?
This is one of those questions I find hard to answer, because my first instinct is to say, I want to see the data.
Yeah.
So I can really only respond.
Observational data,
yeah. Can I just see the meta-analysis, or I think the answer is it depends. I think it depends on industry, organisation. I think there is quite a diversity or a variety in this, but I would argue that we are seeing more of an appreciation and recognition that well-being is important. What we're probably not seeing necessarily in terms of leaders is a recognition that work can actually cause stress and mental health problems. I think leaders are quite comfortable saying, okay, you've got something going on with you. It's making the assumption that it's personal, there's something going on at home for you, or you've got other things going on. It's obviously not work, because it can never be work. That's something I think that leaders could get better at. But yes, I would say I would like to believe that most leaders as I said before, would want to do the right thing, but I do think that there are still deficiencies in terms of skill gaps and people, leaders in particular, genuinely understanding of the role that they play and the system and the environment plays in terms of mental health. And it's not just about helping people to cope, but actually about looking at yourself and your own leadership practices and being prepared to say, you know what, I don't have all the answers, and maybe I haven't been doing this right. And how can I be better? I do think that there is an opportunity for us to develop more of that. So I think it's one thing to maybe say you have a genuine commitment and believe that it's the right thing to do, but when push comes to shove, when you're making a decision or you're having to prioritize competing things, if well-being of your team is always coming last, then that says something.
And I think the stats that you shared before on that recent Gallup survey would suggest that not only the team's coming last, but perhaps the leader's own well-being is becoming last or close to last if the burnout rates are so high. So what advice would you give to emerging leaders who want to build their capabilities around either supporting and enhancing the well-being of their teams or the well-being of themselves?
Really good question. I have observed in terms of emerging leaders, like they're often, not always, but often sort of younger people. I think we're having to educate them less around the importance of these things, because I actually think instinctively they know, because they have experienced it growing up in the next generation, that mental health is a real struggle for a lot of people, and that work can actually be part of the problem or it could be part of the solution. I prefer to think it's part of the solution. So I think my advice for them would be to not shy away from being open to your team around your own experience of work. You may not be comfortable talking about mental health, and in some cases that may not be appropriate, but just simply putting it on the table and being okay to share things and being really genuine and open. I think listening is a really huge thing. So it's one of those, active listening is one of those things we've talked about for forever in leadership and management theory, but just the simple act of actually making time for people and being present and actually asking people questions and asking open questions, not assuming that you know the answer, and actually genuinely caring. You could tell the difference between someone who's asking because they think they listened to a podcast and heard that they should be asking, to someone who actually their intention is, well, I actually want to know you and actually care about you as a human. I think the role modeling, so keeping in mind that people will watch what you do, not what you say. So if you're on the one hand telling people that you want them to work less and to manage their work-home sort of boundaries, and then you're online pinging things, late at night, or they can see that these days you can see when someone's online, like when someone's on Teams. I always notice that, and other people notice that as well. And then look after your own well-being. So I like to say, when you're saying yes to extra work at work, you've got to think about what you're saying no to. And often what we're saying no to is ourselves or to our family. So I think these days, where flexibility is the norm, we actually counterintuitively need to be more disciplined about creating structure around our working hours. Like there's a lot of people now who actually work 9 to 5 by choice because they actually didn't like the blurring of the lines. So I think flexibility is so key in many respects, but also that means we have to just be extra strict about our own around our own boundaries and making sure that we protect time for recovery. Because like athletes, athletes, what they know, because they are peak performers quite often, elite athletes, what they know is that there are periods of working hard, but every time you work hard, that needs to be very explicitly and deliberately followed by periods of recovery. And not recovery as in sitting on the couch, eating a bag of chips, drinking a bottle of wine. Recovery that's active. So because when we're at work, what we find is that you're cognitively overloaded or socially overloaded, depending on what your work is. So you need to do something that is not taxing you in the same way, but is still active. So whether it be listening to a podcast, reading a book, going to see a play, doing some form of active exercise, that means you can't actually think about work. Because if you're still thinking about work, even when you're not at work, then you may as well still be at work because your mind can't tell the difference.
So true. And it's a really difficult one, and the burnout and particularly the leadership burnout topic has been there for a while, and it doesn't really surprise me that the stats keep showing the same things, because quite often the solution, and I'm maybe oversimplifying this, but the solution calls for an organisational intervention, which is to encourage rest, which is to encourage people saying no perhaps more often, and to not work as much, which kind of goes against everything that business has been set up to do, which is constant improvement, constant trajectory of upwards in terms of performance expectations, return, and everything else. And it's a kind of surprising situation that we're in. But I think it might call for, again, I'm going to be segueing into another question where I'm going to be asking about your expertise, and that's around metrics and measurements. So what metrics or indicators do you recommend organisations should use to assess the effectiveness of their leadership teams, to then potentially help highlighting some of these, or the need for some of these solutions or interventions?
Yes. It's a good question. And I think if you'd asked me at the beginning of my career, I would have given you the textbook answer, which is, you've got to be comprehensive as possible. You've got to be doing audits. You need a mixture of qualitative and quantitative, 360-degree surveys, etc. But having spent the last sort of 10, 15 years working in large corporates, which are very noisy places, I think it's not about collecting more data, but being smarter about the questions you ask and the data that you use. And it doesn't have to be complicated. So most organizations measure employee engagement. Now, there's a huge amount of variability in how people measure that, but I think even just asking people about engagement in any way is important, because, as I said earlier, we know that 70% of engagement scores comes back to the quality of the leaders and the relationship people have with their leaders. So you actually are, by asking about engagement or well-being, you are kind of getting to the question of leadership effectiveness. I would also like to see organisations doing more with their turnover data, and lesser absenteeism, because I think now people aren't necessarily taking sick leave like they used to, because if they might just work from home. So I just think the data is a little bit sort of murky there. But if you look at turnover, if you have got patterns of people turning over around the same leader, to actually really dig into that, and I think we're past the point where we can actually have brilliant jerks in an organisation. And I've seen that time and time again. You see a whole bunch of people who can't stand to work with a particular leader, but we make excuses, and that person is brilliant, we need them for X, Y, Z. Well, if people are leaving the organisation, that really does tell a story. But I also don't think that organisations should shy away from actually asking people about stress and burnout in their employee engagement surveys. So it can even just be it doesn't have to be a really academic assessment. Just simply asking people, like what Gallup does, is what percent of the time have they felt stressed, strained, disengaged, burnt out over a period of time. As long as you're tracking that same question over time, you start to develop your own internal benchmarks around that. I also really like the idea of a net promoter score for employees.
Yeah.
We often do it for customers, but if you ask employees how likely they are to recommend their organisation, again, I think that speaks volumes. And then also employee stories. So this is where you get into more of the qualitative side of things. I love data, don't get me wrong, but when you're actually talking to people and hearing the stories that people share at different levels, that can be so helpful in terms of understanding how people are really experiencing the work environment, and to really look at the differences between levels as well. So how people are experiencing it in who are more junior, or who are in more are in roles that have less job control, not just listening to people around you, because the people around you are probably like you, so you're going to hear a very similar story. Whereas as a leader, if you can dig down and try to talk to people that would be surprised to hear from you, that's, I think, where the gold is. I love this idea of truth to power, and the more that we can make it safe for people who may have less power or less control to come forward and share genuinely how they're experiencing things. I think that's really important and speaks to the psychological safety in an organisation.
I think before you were alluding to, you can't fake caring, and nor should you. I think that's a great lesson for senior leaders and CEOs. You can't fake knowing. You should go and speak to people, and not only encourage psychological safety, which is crucially important, and also just go and learn from the source, and
Yes.
and have those relationships and hear what people are saying. Has been super effective.
Yeah, I had I heard something when I lived in London that's just really stuck with me, and it's I think it was by a woman named Megan Reitz or Wrights, but I'll get back to you on that. But the trouble with saying my door is always open, that on the surface that seems like a great thing for a leader to say, and I'm sure it's well intentioned. But if you think about what you're actually also saying, is that, well, I expect you to come to me. I'm not going to come to you. I have a door. I can just close it if I want to. Most people don't have doors these days in offices unless they're very high status. I think leaders need to actually appreciate how scary they are, whether or not they realize it, and actually go out of their way to come out of their proverbial office and make it comfortable for people to tell them and actually ask the question.
Yeah, and then you can measure that as well. Your open door policy. How many people actually come to your door?
No, and you're expecting other people to do your job for you.
Yeah,
and come forward.
Oh, exactly.
Which most people wouldn't feel safe to do that.
I agree. Or the vocal minority, maybe, if you're lucky. Yeah. So I wanted to ask one last question, and it is looking forward a little bit. So asking you to think about what in the future do you think, or what trends do you anticipate will help shape the future of leadership in relation to employee well-being?
Well, it'll be interesting to see if I can foretell any things. We'll have to come back and revisit in 10 years.
Yeah.
I mean, even looking back 10 years, it's interesting because so much has actually changed. I think more and more organisations and leaders will be treating employee wellbeing and holistically, so particularly mental wellbeing as well, as being a real strategic priority. So actually connecting it to business strategy, seeing it as important as profits. I think we'll be seeing an increasing trend for leaders to and organisations to be much more clear and vocal about their purpose. So when I say purpose, I mean obviously talking about the organisational purpose, because we know people are really seeking that purpose-led, purpose-driven work now, but also talking about their own personal purpose, as I did at the start of this podcast, and helping people to really know them on that level of values. I think people are wanting that from a perspective of connection. There is a lot of trends around loneliness as well. So I think there will be more of a focus around how leaders can foster connection and combat loneliness in a more sort of remote, hybrid, often socially isolating world of work.
Yep.
I think we'll also see, hopefully, the rise of more empathy and emotional intelligence as being a real critical skill of leaders. Although I did have a really interesting discussion with some colleagues recently about how that sits within the context of neurodiversity, so how we make it okay for people to lead in a way that aligns with their own strengths, but still being able to do that in a way that makes people feel cared for. And obviously empathy can look different for different people, there's not one size fits all. I also think so we've seen diversity and inclusion now become inclusion and diversity, and then now more recently diversity, equity, inclusion. I think wellbeing will increasingly be connected into that agenda. So it has at the moment been part of the OH&S, more of an OH&S agenda. Sometimes it sits with HR, but I think it is going to be much more connected to diversity, given that our workforces are becoming more diverse. It is really intrinsically connected to this idea of feeling that you belong and feeling included. So I think wellbeing will do that. And I think also we'll need to pay more attention to the wellbeing and burnout of leaders themselves. So as we've talked about on this call, leaders they've got a tough job. It's a pretty tough gig. There's a lot to be thinking about. Burnout levels are high, loneliness levels are high. And interestingly, the wellbeing and mental health and engagement of leaders is actually correlated with the wellbeing and engagement of their teams. So, for multiple reasons. You could argue that it's because when people feel well, they're more likely to kind of engage with people. So, they feel that they have time, that they're more likely to connect, as opposed to when we're burnt out, we often pull away and hunker down in the details. So you can see how that will be connected, but also emotions are contagious. I got really fascinated by this topic earlier in my career about, how do we actually transfer that? But the energy of leaders, whether it be, frenetic, burnt out, stressed energy versus kind of purpose-led, energized, motivated sort of energy, like that does cross over to your teams. So I think they'll be the big ones, and maybe also managing digital burnout. So there will be a point at which we've gone too far, I think, with technology and digital engagement. So just thinking about how we manage that in the context of work as well.
Awesome. Excellent. Great predictions. I suppose we'll have to see in 10 years' time how they come out. We've got a recording of it here, which is useful and handy. But great insights, and all throughout this conversation you've been giving us gold and lots of tips, lots of things to try, lots of insights. Thanks for being so generous, and thanks for joining us on this call, Kat. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Oh, thanks for asking such interesting questions.
Thank you. And that wraps today's episode with Dr. Kathryn Page. Thank you again to Kat for sharing your profound expertise and also actionable advice on both leadership and workplace wellbeing. To our listeners, thanks for tuning in. If today's discussion sparked any questions, or if you're looking to dive deeper into creating effective wellbeing strategies within your organisation, remember we're here to help at Ixona. So feel free to reach out to us via LinkedIn, via email, via our website to learn more about our work. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and keep up with our latest episodes with more interviews and more conversations about employee experience, wellbeing, leadership, culture, and all else. Until next time, take care.